In the early hours of March 6, 1943, Task Force 68 advanced through the Solomon Islands. Aboard the USS Montpelier, radar operators scan the sea, their screens quietly humming with faint returns. The glow of instruments lights up the faces of fire control officers as they track two fast-moving blips off the starboard bow. Moments earlier, the task force had slipped past Kolombangara's southern shore, cruisers and destroyers in perfect formation, engines running silent. Somewhere out there, Japanese destroyers are moving too, likely unaware of the trap they're sailing into. Rear Admiral Aaron S. Merrill's force has one objective: bombard the Japanese base at Vila and cripple its ability to stage further operations. But before they reach their target, the enemy emerges. Murasame and Minegumo returning from a routine supply run. The radar locks on, guns are primed. The Battle of Blackett Strait is about to begin. By early 1943, the balance of naval power in the South Pacific was tilting, slowly but unmistakably, against the Japanese Empire. The 6-month bloodletting around Guadalcanal had ended in a decisive Allied victory. Drained and overstretched, the Imperial Japanese Navy began what would become a long and bitter strategic retreat across the Solomons. The battle for Guadalcanal had cost the Japanese not just ships and aircraft, but experienced air crews, irreplaceable destroyers, and precious strategic initiative. Tokyo's high command had envisioned an advance toward Australia. Now it was instead scrambling to build defensive depth across the Solomon chain, focusing on strong points like Kolombangara, New Georgia, and the vital base at Rabaul. Yet even in retreat, Japan retained formidable striking power, particularly in the realm of night surface combat. Fast destroyers, skilled lookouts, and deadly long-lance torpedoes gave the Imperial Navy continued lethality after dark. For the United States Navy, the lessons of Guadalcanal had been costly, but instructive. Among the key choke points in the Central Solomons was Blackett Strait, a narrow and reef-fringed passage separating Kolombangara from Arundel Island. By March 1943, it had become a vital artery for the so-called Tokyo Express, the nightly runs of destroyers and barges supplying Japanese garrisons across the archipelago. These missions were launched primarily from the Shortland Islands and Buin on Bougainville, and would often hug coastlines or exploit poor visibility to avoid Allied air detection. Though the tempo of Japanese shipping had decreased following their Guadalcanal withdrawal, the lifeline through the strait remained active and dangerous. For the Americans, disrupting these reinforcement routes was more than tactical. It was operationally essential. New Georgia had already been selected as the Allies' next stepping stone in the drive toward Rabaul, the principal Japanese stronghold in the Southwest Pacific. The airfield at Munda, located on New Georgia's southwestern coast, was central to both Japan's defense of the region and Allied plans for seizure. Any Japanese build-up at nearby Kolombangara or Vila would stiffen resistance at Munda and jeopardize the momentum the Allies had fought hard to gain. Yet Operation Toenails, the code name for the invasion of New Georgia, was still in the planning phase. Before the assault could begin, the Allies needed to weaken Japan's ability to reinforce the island. This meant denying staging points, particularly Vila, on the southern tip of Kolombangara. The US Navy thus entered a new phase of aggressive, radar-supported night operations. In contrast to the disasters of 1942, like Savo Island and Tassafaronga, American forces were now fielding ships equipped with advanced radar and commanders trained to exploit it. The SG radar, a 10-centimeter surface search set introduced late in 1942, gave US cruisers and destroyers the unprecedented ability to detect destroyer-sized contacts at 10 to 12 miles, roughly 16 to 19 kilometers, even in total darkness. For the Japanese, who relied primarily on optics and had only limited radar deployment, mainly the Type 22, this was a dangerous asymmetry. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, recognized that technology alone would not win the night. Haunted by the losses at Tassafaronga in November 1942, where superior US firepower had been squandered due to poor fire control and target confusion, Halsey emphasized tight doctrine refined coordination, and radar-directed gunnery. Destroyer raids became not just operational interdiction missions, but practical experiments, battlefield laboratories, as some US officers called them. Out of this environment emerged Rear Admiral Aaron S. Tip Merrill, a soft-spoken but highly capable cruiser officer. Merrill commanded Task Force 68, a mixed force of 3 Cleveland-class light cruisers, Montpelier, his flagship, Cleveland, and Denver, and 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Waller, Coney, and Conway. The cruisers were newly built, armed with 6-inch dual-purpose guns, fire control radar, and well-drilled crews. The destroyers, hardened by previous engagements, formed the outer shell of this task force, trained in high-speed maneuver and torpedo deployment. Merrill's doctrine emphasized a blend of radar targeting and cautious aggression. Rather than closing to visual range, as had often led to disaster, his ships were drilled to track, classify, and engage contacts entirely by radar, using fire control solutions relayed to gunnery directors and refined by radar plotters in real time. Unlike in earlier Pacific battles, where confusion and poor situational awareness had plagued US task forces, Merrill's command sought to fight blind with technological clarity. As February drew to a close, signs of renewed Japanese logistical activity around Kolombangara became impossible to ignore. Allied reconnaissance aircraft reported increased barge traffic across Blackett Strait, while coast watchers noted new construction and offloading activity at Vila. The Japanese were clearly expanding the base into a more permanent barge staging area. This build-up was increasingly reliant on small, stealthy craft. Wooden barges and motor launchers, crude, slow but effective, had begun to supplement traditional destroyer runs. These vessels hugged coastlines, operated beneath jungle canopy, and could slip through reef-choked straits by night. Though harder to destroy in large numbers, they were difficult to detect or interdict, and they kept the trickle of Japanese supplies flowing. But the Japanese were also under mounting pressure. The previous year's defeats, especially the heavy naval losses around Guadalcanal, had decimated their logistics fleet. With fewer transport ships available, the Imperial Navy was forced to rely on destroyers and barges for frontline resupply. The result was a precarious supply system. Destroyers now served double duty as high-speed transports and escorts, while the lightly constructed barges remained highly vulnerable to air attack. Compounding these challenges was geography. The Japanese lacked detailed hydrographic knowledge of the Solomons' interior waterways. Reef-studded channels, narrow passes, and uncharted hazards made night navigation difficult, particularly for small craft operating without radar or modern navigation aids. Miscalculations were frequent, and groundings or delays could disrupt even well-timed operations. At the same time, the US had gained a critical foothold in the Central Solomons. On February 21st, US forces seized the Russell Islands without resistance, allowing construction of new airfields and giving American aircraft direct access to New Georgia. From this new position, air coverage over the Central Solomons improved dramatically, reducing Japan's daytime mobility and increasing pressure on their night lifeline. With intelligence reports mounting and operational windows narrowing, Halsey authorized a preemptive move. In early March, Merrill's cruisers were tasked with striking Vila directly, aiming to destroy supplies ashore and, ideally, intercept Japanese shipping in transit. The plan was to time the bombardment to coincide with one of the frequent Tokyo Express runs, catching both infrastructure and destroyers in a single, concentrated blow. To aid in the operation, 2 US submarines, Grampus and Greyback, were stationed along the likely withdrawal routes through Kula Gulf. These submarines, experienced in earlier Solomon patrols, were ordered to watch for fleeing Japanese warships or to intercept reinforcements, attempting to slip in behind Merrill's cruisers. Grampus, in particular, was known for its aggressive posture, but in the days that followed, she would vanish without trace, possibly sunk by the very ships Merrill was preparing to confront. On the evening of March 5th, Task Force 68 departed Purvis Bay, moving up the slot under radio silence. Crews aboard the cruisers reviewed their bombardment coordinates. Radar operators adjusted calibration, preparing for night contact. Unbeknownst to Merrill, 2 Japanese destroyers, Murasame and Minagumo, had just completed a routine supply run to Vila and were beginning their return voyage. Both vessels, part of Destroyer Squadron 4 under Captain Masao Tachibana, chose to take the shorter but more dangerous route through Kula Gulf. Perhaps they hoped to save time, or believed the Americans were still unaware of Vila's growing role. Either way, they sailed directly into the jaws of Merrill's approaching task force. As Merrill's Task Force 68 steamed westward through the slot under a moonless sky, radar operators aboard the cruisers tracked the coastlines of Kolombangara and Arundel as the ships slipped past the volcanic silhouettes. Lookouts reported no surface contacts. The only sounds were the low thrum of engines and the occasional signal light exchange between ships. Overhead, a lone Black Cat patrol plane monitored the coastline, confirming earlier intelligence that Vila was still in use as a staging area for barge activity. The Japanese destroyers operating in the strait that night, Murasame and Minagumo, were conducting a routine supply and reinforcement run to Vila. Both were part of Destroyer Squadron 4, commanded by Captain Masao Tachibana. These destroyers were frequently tasked with both escort and supply duties, often ferrying troops or cargo in barrels and bags slung from deck gear to barges. They had completed offloading supplies at Vila and were returning through Blackett Strait. They had no knowledge of the American presence and took no special precautions, moving at moderate speed and silhouetted against the coastline to radar-equipped warships. At 0:57, the radar teams aboard Merrill's cruisers detected what first appeared to be a stationary landmass, Sasamboki Island, on the starboard side of their formation. But within moments, the contact moved, then split in two. This was the first confirmation of enemy ships, placing them in direct line with the task force's advance. The radar operators tracked the two Japanese destroyers at a range of approximately 11,000 yards, closing rapidly. Merrill's ships adjusted their plots. Gunnery crews braced in near silence, surrounded by flickering control dials and the hum of electrical gear. In the darkened plotting rooms and control towers, final solutions were calculated. Silence gave way to a terse transmission. Stand by to commence firing. At precisely 1:01, Merrill's cruisers unleashed their opening salvos. All three light cruisers, Montpelier, Cleveland, and Denver, fired simultaneously from starboard batteries, their 6-inch guns sending shells arcing into the dark over 10,000 yards of sea. Their target was the lead Japanese destroyer, Murasame. In accordance with radar-directed doctrine, all American ships concentrated their initial fire on the nearest contact. Within moments, Murasame was bracketed by shell splashes. The 6th salvo struck her with devastating effect. Simultaneously, USS Waller launched 5 torpedoes at Murasame. At least one of these found its mark shortly after the shell hits. A large explosion followed, violent enough to be heard 25 miles away by Captain Briscoe's destroyers off Munda. Flames and secondary blasts engulfed the destroyer. In less than 15 minutes, she had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Aboard Minagumo, her captain, Lieutenant Commander Tokuno, ordered evasive action as he passed to the east of the burning wreck. He maneuvered northeast, but the American radar-directed guns were already adjusting. At 1:06, the cruisers shifted fire to the second destroyer. Despite returning fire and aiming by visual reference to the American gun flashes, Minagumo stood little chance. The American fire was precise. Within minutes, shellfire disabled her engines and ignited fires throughout the superstructure. Somewhere in this exchange, Minagumo may have attempted to launch torpedoes, but no hits were recorded. American maneuvering and speed likely played a role in avoiding such attacks. USS Waller, closest to the Japanese line of retreat, was prepared to intercept, but did not come under effective enemy fire. By 1:14, Minagumo was listing heavily. Her surviving crew began abandoning ship. A total of 174 Japanese sailors from both destroyers would survive by swimming to Kolombangara's coast. The American ships, meanwhile, regrouped. The tactical cohesion of Task Force 68 remained intact. Destroyers like USS Conway and Coney maintained station at the flanks, covering any potential torpedo approach vectors. By 1:14, the last visible flames of Minagumo were fading as survivors struggled toward the Kolombangara shore. Lookouts aboard the cruisers kept scanning for additional contacts. Reports from aerial reconnaissance had warned of possible follow-on Japanese units, but none materialized. As a precaution, sonar operators aboard the American destroyers searched for submarines, but the sea returned only silence. The Black Cat above relayed that Vila's coast installations had not yet responded to the gunfire. At 1:24, with the destroyer threat eliminated and visibility aided by faint shorelight from earlier explosions, Merrill ordered a course adjustment to commence the primary bombardment run. The ships altered bearing northeast, forming into a line-ahead formation for maximum gunnery effectiveness. This shift placed the cruisers approximately 2 miles off the Kolombangara coastline, near Tungarili Point. The bombardment began in measured sequence. Each cruiser elevated her guns toward designated coordinates, targets that had been assigned in pre-mission planning and cross-referenced by overhead spotters. Montpelier focused on the main supply dumps and suspected aircraft dispersal zones, while Cleveland and Denver struck runways, fuel stores, and troop bivouacs. The coordination of this fire was directed through synchronized radar and visual corrections from the Black Cat, flying above at medium altitude. The volume of fire was heavy, but precisely delivered. Shore batteries responded sluggishly at first. The Japanese artillery, likely caught off guard and still recovering from the sudden loss of their destroyer escort, opened fire with sporadic rounds from known battery positions. Counter-battery fire from the cruisers quickly found these sources. Flash detection and radar-directed return volleys silenced 2 known gun pits within minutes. Observers in the Black Cat reported secondary explosions in the fuel and ammunition zones, indications of successful target acquisition. By 1:40, the 16-minute bombardment window closed. Task Force 68 had expended a substantial portion of its high explosive ammunition allotment. Merrill ordered the force to reverse course and begin withdrawal. The cruisers increased speed to 30 knots. The destroyers reformed into their screening positions, alert for any signs of enemy pursuit. Merrill's report to Admiral Halsey that morning declared the sinking of 2 light cruisers. This was based on the large radar signatures and the volume of return fire perceived in the engagement. Though mistaken in classification, the result remained significant. 2 frontline Japanese destroyers had been eliminated and the shore facilities at Vila damaged. Not a single US ship had been hit. Parallel to this operation, the US submarine Grampus, tasked with interdicting Japanese movements out of the Kula Gulf, had not been heard from since the evening of March 5th. Her disappearance remains a mystery. Some later reports speculated that she may have encountered the Japanese destroyers before their engagement with Merrill's force, but no definitive evidence was found. Her loss would be one of the few American costs during this phase of operations. In just under 40 minutes, Task Force 68 had neutralized 2 enemy destroyers, bombarded a strategic airfield, and withdrawn in good order. For Merrill's cruisers and destroyers, the engagement was a tactical affirmation of radar-directed doctrine. For the Japanese, it underscored the growing vulnerability of nighttime supply runs through waters increasingly dominated by Allied detection and coordination technologies. For the US Navy, the operation marked a turning point. Radar, discipline, and coordination had delivered a clean result. The destroyers had struck first and vanished before the enemy could respond, an outcome that would have been unthinkable months earlier. At last, it seemed the balance in night fighting was beginning to shift, but the implications ran deeper. The Japanese Navy, once confident in its mastery of night engagements, had lost 2 frontline destroyers without landing a single effective shot. For commanders in Rabaul and further north in Tokyo, the Blackett Strait engagement was a warning, one that raised difficult questions about the security of their supply routes and the reliability of long-held doctrine. Still, the strait remained contested. Vila was not yet silenced, and the next phase of the Solomons campaign was already taking shape. American destroyers would return to these waters. So would the Japanese. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like. It really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.